Hello, my name is Ray Pianca. I'm judge of the Cleveland Municipal Housing Court. The Cleveland Municipal Housing Court is charged with enforcing the codified ordinances of the City of Cleveland having to do with the health, housing, building, safety, fire, or zoning codes. The codified ordinances outline the minimum requirements for people to maintain their homes in the City of Cleveland. Today we're focusing in on the ordinance 369.15a, which requires homes to be weather tight. And you can imagine, with the housing stock in the City of Cleveland, the majority of it clapboard siding, which needs to be painted from time to time, this is quite an obligation. The court is conducting these workshops to provide information for homeowners on painting their homes. And in the case of painting of homes where the paint has failed, try to give some explanations and reasons for the failure of that paint, using Jim LaRue, who is with House Menders Incorporated. Jim has a long history in working in Cleveland's neighborhoods and working on home maintenance. Jim, you know, there are people all over the city of Cleveland that have these houses that are made of wood. In fact, Cleveland's noted for that. Some cities are built out of brick. But the majority of the houses in Cleveland are these clapboard sided houses. And paint peels, it pops off, it fails, and ultimately, if people don't take care of it, they could end up in housing court, as many have. What causes paint to peel off a house?
Well, mostly it's moisture. And there are a number of ways in which that moisture is a problem. One, if we get ice back up on the roof, water can back up underneath the shingles, get into the overhang on the side of the house, and then drain down in the wall. When that moisture drains down inside the wall, it makes the sheathing behind wet, and then it dries to the surface and causes the paint to peel.
So it literally just pushes that paint right off the wood.
What happens when the sun is shining, the sun actually drives moisture into the wall during the day, and at night when it cools, the moisture then moves this way. So you get this moisture movement in the wood, back and forth, back and forth. And in the evening when it's cold, that moisture will just wick to the surface and can cause a problem. Another thing that happens a lot is gutters back up and water drains down the face, and in the wintertime you'll see ice running down the face of the siding. That ice freezes on the surface, and the weight of the ice and then the thawing and the freezing will pull the paint off of the surface. So that's another moisture condition. Another very interesting thing we've learned is over the years, if paint's coming down the face of the wall and there's cracks between the pieces of siding, as there almost always are, the moisture will actually wick up underneath with what's called capillary action. And if we had water running down this board right now, we could take this board out after a rainstorm, and you'd see moisture on the back of this board about halfway up. Well, that moisture is not drying immediately. It dries to the surface, and it's why we often see the paint peeling along this edge more than any other.
Than farther up.
Yeah.
And so having a tight seal along where the clapboard meets is very important.
Well,
it
can be, but one of the ironies is sometimes having some opening there permits us to let moisture out and lets the wall dry. So I'll make a point a little later about that when we're talking about application of paints.
And sometimes I've seen people drill holes in and put vents in the
Ultimately,
siding.
that's not very successful, though we did do an experiment several years ago when we put wedges underneath the siding, and that in fact did help in a couple of situations where there was too much moisture in the wall. Make a couple other points about why paint fails. I've been in a number of homes where people have dryers in the basement, and the dryer is venting into the basement and not out through a vent. And all of that moisture gets up inside the sidewalls, especially if there's no insulation in the sidewalls, as is true in many old homes. And all that moisture gets up. I've been to a couple of houses where the paint had peeled halfway up, and it's where there was a block in the wall, and the moisture had gotten that far and then caused the paint to peel just in those three boards.
So you could see all the way around the house where the fire stop was.
Exactly.
And, because the dryer's moist air just pushed it right in there, then pushed the paint off.
Paint off. And then the other thing that happens with paint is we just get too many layers of paint. and there's only so many layers of paint that can be bonded, and pretty soon the sheer weight of the paint, and you'll start to get fracture of the material, some checking, and the material will start to flake off just because there's too much paint.
And that checking, is that called alligatoring, where
Yeah,
it causes that sort of condition?
Right. That often happens because you get two different kinds of paint that that are not compatible with each other.
Such as latex and oil paint
Well,
together,
latex
or?
and oil usually are okay.
Uh-huh.
What they're now currently recommending, and I'll get to that in a moment, is putting a oil-based primer and then putting a latex finish coat. Because latex paint is actually more durable than oil paints.
Than oil paint.
Yeah,
huh?
yeah.
Now, just back to the dryer quickly. Now, many people in the winter vent their dryer into the basement.
Yeah.
Warm, moist air because the house is being dried out because the furnace is going. Is that something they should do or not do, or?
Generally not a good idea.
It isn't?
No, it's
Ah.
not a good idea. And very often that's where the moisture comes from that's causing the paint to peel. And in the wintertime, it's so much colder that you're more likely to get condensate from the inside on the outside walls. And so you actually, it's worse in the winter than in the summer if you're doing that.
Ah.
Well, those are the basic reasons why the paint is failing. What I want to do now is get some materials together and talk a little bit about how we prepare a surface to paint, especially a real old surface like this.
Okay. Jim, there are a number of people that have come into court who cited for painting their homes, and they've said, well, I've just painted my house last year and the paint's falling off. So how important is preparation?
It's everything. Almost more important than the materials you put on is the preparation that you do. And the other thing that people do is they end up painting in the sun. And if you paint this surface in the sun, what happens is the paint dries on the surface too quickly, and the liquid that needs to evaporate from the paint gets trapped underneath the skin of the paint. And then we end up with a bubble of liquid underneath the surface of the paint, and it peels the paint off.
So the majority of paint is liquid, and that has to dry off in
Has to
order to have the
evaporate.
film on there.
Exactly.
And that's true not only for latex, but also for oil paint?
Right. In oil, we have the thinner that's a part of the paint, and in latex paint, we have water. But in both cases, I've seen houses where on the same day that they were painting, you see big bubbles, and the bubbles are caused by painting in the sun. The other thing is if you paint on a dirty surface, then the paint bonds to the dust and not to the surface, and it isn't long before that paint is peeling off. So if you don't take the time to clean the surface, you're in trouble. Let me just demonstrate a few things here. Most important thing with with old surfaces like this is that you scrape most of the excess paint off. And oh, by the way, we want to have a drop cloth down here to catch all of that material. And
because this house presumably has lead
no
in
question
its paint.
about it. So we want a drop cloth, and then we'll scrape most of it. Now, people say, can I get a belt sander or something else? The problem with that is that you're generating all of that dust and creating a problem. So what you're going to want to do when you're working on this is have a dust mask that you can wear to keep this stuff out of your face.
Yep. The other thing that I've heard is problem with the belt sander is that it gouges the wood, and there's a sort of a protective surface on the wood already, and if you get down into that layer that's a little softer, it could damage even more.
That's partly true, though sometimes the fibers on the surface are so old that they're dead, and rubbing some of those fibers off and getting to a fresh surface
Helps for adhesion.
May help, yeah. But the main thing is you don't want to be circulating that lead dust. So you want to effectively scrape and get absolutely as much as you possibly can. And if, in light of this house not having had paint for many, many years, I would even recommend, if there's time and the energy, to strip whatever paint is here using chemical strippers. You can use heat guns, but the risk with an old house like this is the chance of fire.
You know, Jim, there's various type of scrapers in addition to the one that you've used on there. It almost looks like a dental office here.
Would you like me to work on your teeth?
No, I'd appreciate if you wouldn't, but maybe work on the house here.
Many of these older homes that are so lovely have different kinds of trim on them, and trying to get that scraped out with a flat scraper doesn't work. So having tools with these various kinds of points makes it possible to get into places that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get into. And it's very handy to have an extra scraper to do that kind of work. So I would want to get as much of it off as possible, and then you'll want to lightly sand the whole surface.
Now, now, Jim, you mentioned heat guns, and there are people that use them. Now, some people use a torch, and that's probably the worst thing that you could do.
The fire department will tell you they've been called out more times than they would like to deal with that kind of a problem. There's no way on an old house like this you can get through it without setting it on fire someplace. I just would strongly urge not touching that. I mean, peeling paint is one thing, burning your house down is another. So you want to get this as smooth as, as cleaned off as possible, so that we can then use the materials, and make sure you get all of the edges, then the next thing is to deal with any wood problems that you may find. You may find that there's a hole in the wood. On a piece of siding like this, you might put some caulk into a crack.
So would you put it in a crack this small? Should
No,
you put caulk
that
in there?
wouldn't be a problem. But in a larger crack, you might want to put that in. You might caulk a seam like this.
Right.
And then put wood filler in cracks that are in holes in the wood. And there are a number of products that folks can use. A very inexpensive one is Durham's water putty. The important thing is when you use any of these fillers is you put a primer on it shortly after it dries. Otherwise, the moisture in the wood around it will pop it out again.
And these wood fillers, these aren't water resistant, are they?
No, this particular one is not. There are epoxy fillers that you can buy that are much more expensive, but you'll want to fill those holes with that stuff. And then the other thing you're going to want to do is put putty on places, on windows and other places where you may have a problem. We have one small spot right here I can show you. And you get some glazing compound. You can see the spot right here. You want to just fill those in before you finish your painting. And it's not a difficult thing to do. You just pop the putty in there and then just take your putty knife at the same angle as the other putty and cut it off. And we've now got a fresh putty edge on there, and we'll be ready for paint.
Now, Jim, I know on my windows where I've just put putty on, the window was so dry that it seemed to pull everything out of the putty, and it became chalky and broke off. So I had to put some linseed oil on there to
It's a good idea.
put a little moisture in there.
It's a good idea. You can put linseed oil on, or you can take your primer and put it on if it's real dry.
Put the primer on, and then you put the putty
Yeah,
on.
right. And why I like some of the primers that dry within a half hour, you can prime it and then you can get back to it shortly thereafter. But that's a good point. It very often does dry out.
And the putty prevents the moisture from going into the house. Is that right?
Right.
Or moisture getting out?
The push points that hold the glass in place are what hold the glass. The putty only seals the glass to the wood and keeps the moisture from getting in around the edge and causing it to fail.
Okay.
But it's important because replacing windows is incredibly expensive, and simple bit. Remember, we've been talking all along in every one of our segments.
Yes.
A little bit of maintenance saves hundreds of dollars worth of repair. Well, with proper scraping and sanding and wood filling and the other things that we do with putty, the last thing is water. And it's a good idea to have a bucket. When I'm painting, often have a bucket on one side of my ladder and paint on the other side. And then you just wipe down the surfaces with that rag. On an old house like this, I would not power wash, which we normally would recommend, because we're driving so much water up underneath all of this, it's going to take a long time for it to dry out.
But you're using a bucket of water or some sort of cleaning.
Right.
And what does that mean as far as the paint? Because you're wiping it off and it's sort of a moist surface. Do you let it dry?
If you're using a latex paint, that's not much of a problem. But we're not soaking it here. All we're trying to do is wipe the dirt off the surface and wipe the dust off the surface. So you need a damp rag. We're not scrubbing it down on this case. Now, if we have a house that's just basically getting a fresh coat of paint and it's not in bad shape, you might power wash and then let it sit for a couple of days until it dries and then come back to do it again.
Now on this house, this siding's 120 years old, and so it's very dry.
Yep.
Is there something you should do to put on this to give it a little more life?
That's what we'll talk about next, is the
Okay.
various materials we're going to use. Okay?
All right. Jim, you talked about some products that you can use for preparation of the wood.
Yeah.
And what do you have there?
Well, when you've got the enormous task that they have on this house, which is getting back to preparing wood that's not been painted for years and years and years. This wood is dried out, and it needs a conditioner to get started again. And what is currently being recommended is a mixture of linseed oil and some thinner, maybe 50-50. And then you put that on first onto the bare wood. And what you're doing is putting some oils into the wood and providing a better base. Then secondly, and this is where it gets really expensive to do because it's adding yet another step, you then put your primer, and they are currently recommending a oil-based primer on the surface. So you've got the linseed oil thinner combo, then when that dries, then you've got the primer. Then they're recommending 2 coats of latex paint.
2 coats?
2 coats of finished paint. And the Forest Products Lab in Wisconsin has done a series of studies over the last few years. They found latex to be more durable than oils, but using the oils for the initial thing provides a better bond to the wood. And once they have got that on, then they go with the 2 coats. Now, what I recommend that people do is do a test area before they rush into painting a whole house. So I would take a section of a few boards and get into picking the various materials they're going to use, apply them, and see how it's holding up. And there's a little trick that you can do. It's called the Band-Aid trick. If you want to test whether your paint is bonding effectively or not, after you've gotten it painted for 24 hours, go out to the paint with a Band-Aid and just put that Band-Aid on the paint and press it on there and leave it on there for a moment, and then just snap the Band-Aid off. Now this has been on here for a bit, it won't, but you'll notice that there's one spot on here where I tested, and it pulled the paint right off, which means that a primer was a good idea. So if you do the 2 steps that we talked about on this old wood, now most of us aren't going to need to do that. We can just do the primer.
We just know what
and go to the next
we're
step.
going.
But this is a little test you can do to see if you're bonding okay. It's the Band-Aid test.
Well, and this is a case where a Band-Aid approach is probably the best one.
Yes. Okay, we'll call this the Band-Aid approach.
Yes.
But it will be a way of finding out whether the paint's bonding, and that's really important. If you're going to go to all this work, you really need to know it's working for you.
And not only is it work, but it's expense, the product, and then if you have to repaint the next year.
Yeah. Now, what I would recommend in terms of materials is that you use the product from the same company. Use all the products from the same company, whether it's Sherwin-Williams or Sears or Benjamin Moore, because there's a better chance that all their materials will be compatible with each other. So if you're going out to get these basic materials, get their oil-based primer and then use their latex. That way you have a better chance of reducing one more variable that could cause a problem with your paint. Now, the other thing is, it's a good idea when you're painting to not leave it go a long time between different things that you're doing. In other words, if you're going to prime this week, don't wait a month before you paint, because you're reducing the value of the primer and you can get it weakened. You put the primer on, and then as soon as possible come back with your finished materials. So rather than prime the whole house and then come back and paint, you really should prime and paint as you go along.
So you should do it a section at a time, and perhaps on this house you would do the linseed oil thinner treatment and then come in how long after that to put on the
within 24
primer?
to 48 hours it would be set up. And
put
then
the primer on,
on.
and then if you use latex, 1 coat of latex and then the other coat,
right.
So don't do one thing all over the house. Do it at a section at a time.
Right, a section at a time. And that way you're also learning as you go what's working. And then just remember the point, don't paint in the sun. Make sure that you follow the sun by a couple of hours or stay ahead of it by a couple of hours so that you're not creating a problem for yourself. With those few basic tips, most folks will get a decent job out of their paint.
How long should a paint job last?
Well, with all of this work, I would hope that they wouldn't need to touch it again for 7 or 8 years. And paints now are allegedly warranted for 20 years and so on. Well, it's only a function of the condition of the surfaces themselves. The paint may very well hold for 20 years on a brand new perfect surface, but that's not likely to be the case in most older homes.
It looks like this paint job was done about 50 years ago.
Oh,
so.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
And it's been, now the plus is it's not going to be as much work cleaning it off,
Right.
But there's going to be a lot of work in terms of painting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jim, I see you've brought this screening today, and I was wondering how this enters into the factor of maintaining your home.
Well, it's another magic solution to the gutter that will never ever be dirty again, which doesn't finally work.
Well, you know, I've put this in, and the seeds go down, and it helps protect the seeds in my gutters.
Well, actually, it keeps the major leaves out.
Okay.
But it won't keep squirrels out.
Oh,
and
all right.
I've had mine thrown out by the squirrels.
Oh, they've
usually.
ripped mine right
Yeah,
off
right.
the...
There are no magic solutions. There are a couple of gutter companies now that make metal caps on gutters. One of the concerns with some of those is that the leaves pile up on top of them, and then the water drains right down the side of the house. So they don't get stuff in the gutter, but you don't get as much water in the gutter as you like either. No, so that there's the search for the perfect gutter is going on. But if people cannot afford other things, this is a very inexpensive thing you can put into the gutter to keep most of that stuff out. Now, the primary reason for keeping it out of the gutter is so it doesn't go down into the storm drain.
Jim, this gutter goes down below the ground and starts at the roof. What's all this about here?
Well, the downspouts come from the gutters, and the gutters are carrying water away from the house. If we get moisture around our foundation, that could cause problems for the foundation wall. And we want to get as much of that water away from here as we can. A house of this size will give off as many as 1,200 gallons of water in a 1-inch rain. So that water has to go someplace. Now, the traditional method for getting rid of it is to run it down into a storm drain, which is in the ground. There's two kinds of pipe in the ground. One is a drain tile at the footer of the house, and the other is a storm drain, which picks this up, and it carries it around to the front of the house and then out to a storm drain in the street. But what happens over the years is those clay tile pipes that were there start to break up, and the water drains down along the foundation wall, and people end up with water in their basement. That can create molds and mildews in basements and can be a real problem. So what I usually suggest is that people do a few tests to find out what's going on. And the first test is to remove a section of this downspout about this high off the ground, and then just put an elbow on it about right here, and then take another piece of downspout and run the water away from the house.
About how far away?
About 5 feet away if you can. Now, that won't always be possible, but you want to run the water away, and when you remove all of these, what I've found over the years is about 85% of the time that stops the water in the basement.
85% of the time?
In other words, the storm drains are broken or not working well, and the water is backing up into the basement through those pipes.
Now, there's some question I know by people whether they can do that in Cleveland or not, and if for their particular application they could call their building inspector or the housing department, in fact, talk to the commissioner or assistant commissioner about what's allowed. I understand that in a single family house, you are allowed to do this, drain it away from the house, as long as it doesn't go on your neighbor's property.
Right, or go back against your own, because that can be a problem. Now, if once this is disconnected and you find that in fact is solving your problem, then it would be good to check with the commissioner's office or inspector, and you could just leave these out then, and that would stop the water coming into your basement.
So then it just washes it away, and if it drains on your property, your lot, then you've saved the cost of having to redo all of that drain tile.
Enormous amount saved. Now, if you have a driveway, it would be good to run it to the driveway, because then the driveway can carry the water to the street very often.
Okay.
Now, what you may want to do is clean these drains out that are in the ground, and you can have a company come and snake them to the street. And the problem is those things may be full of stuff. I wanted to show you, this is a pack of roots that was inside a pipe that was below the ground.
Amazing. And of course all of the water and nutrients come down and help feed this root and the tree that it supports.
And many, many times over the years in doing rehabs, I've dug down and we found whole pieces of clay tile full of roots like this. And obviously there's no water going through this pipe.
Right. Well, what do you do when you have roots in your
Well, sometimes you can clean them out. And but one of the problems is if they're broken, and sometimes these roots, like in a root-bound pot, are so strong they can break the crock. And so you need to replace the crock and dig around the house. But if you've done this test and find out that you don't need to do that, well, then the city approves, all the better, because it's one less thing you have to do.
Now, is there a chemical that you can put in there to try to kill these roots, or you just have to snake it out?
One little thing you can do is go to a building supply center and get some copper sulfate or some other chemicals that you could put like in a silk stocking or a pantyhose thing in a drain in the basement. So every time water is draining from the laundry, it's pushing some water out into the sewer line. And then you could do the same thing in one of these downspouts, so that when water is running, it would wash over those chemicals and take a little bit of the chemical down there.
And that chemical then would eliminate the root growing
Well, it eliminates it temporarily. If you've got a lot of trees, and then you don't want to kill trees. So you have to decide what's best. And my feeling is that if you remove the downspout and it's working, let that go. Now, what often happens is that people will get some water washing down alongside the house, and you can take asphalt crack filler and fill in along the edge of the wall.
Oh, okay.
There are soil levels that are not properly pitched, so repitching your soil. And interestingly, about the worst thing we can do for a foundation with moisture is to put flower beds around the house, and yet we all do it. Because the flower bed becomes a catch basin for water that just then soaks in the ground and makes the wall damp. It would be better if we had the water draining like 3 feet on grass to a flower bed 3 feet away from the house.
Oh, I see, yes.
That way you're not getting that water down around your foundation.
Oh, what a great idea, because practically every house has a flower bed and bushes planted all around the foundation of the house.
Now, recently a program at the University of Illinois Small Homes Council came up with a terrific idea. They said, think of the soil around your house as a roof for your basement. And they came up with this idea of taking EPDM, which is the black rubber roof that you put on a roof, and dig out away from your house about 2 feet and down about 16 inches, and put this rubber roofing against your foundation, fastening it to the foundation wall with the fasteners that they use for masonry.
Yes.
And then down and out, and then backfill it. So what you've done is create a flashing between the house and the ground, so that water coming down on the surface can't get into your foundation wall. It's a terrific
what a great idea.
So with those basic simple tests, people can find out where their water is coming from, and may be able to save themselves thousands and thousands of dollars of excessive digging. And as I said, about 85% of the time, my feeling is that the digging probably isn't necessary because the storm drains are the problem. And get that water away from the house, don't let it mess with the neighbor's house, and don't let it rest around your own foundation, and you can be in pretty good shape.
Great idea.